Thank you so much for coming. I'm Maureen Meyer, the Vice President for Programs at the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA. We wanted to thank Senator Kaine's office and the staff for their support in hosting this event with us, as well as the Chilean Embassy for their partnership with us in this discussion. As you all know, we are here to commemorate the coup of September 11, 1973, when the Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, overthrew the democratically elected government of Sandoval. Thousands of people were killed or disappeared, tens of thousands tortured, hundreds of thousands forced into exile. The conditions for these atrocities were set in part by the destabilization efforts of the United States government. And on this occasion, we wanted to do more than remember the coup and the atrocities that followed. We want to remember the courage to resist. These events in Chile mobilized the human rights movement throughout the Americas and internationally. It resulted in the founding of our organization, WOLA, and led to Congress being much more active on U.S. foreign policy in the defense of human rights. So I want to start by welcoming you all and introducing WOLA's president, Gabriel, who's going to do the introductions of our speakers. Thank you so much for coming.
Buenas tardes. We're very happy to have you all here, so thank you for coming. Today is a very special day, because today is Chile's Independence Day. So we're incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to discuss Chile, Chilean history, and Ambassador, we're incredibly grateful that you, on the day of Chilean independence, come here with us, so we thank you. I want to introduce Representative Joaquin Castro, and we're very grateful also for your time and for agreeing to give some opening remarks. As you all know, Representative Castro is the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee's subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere. And very recently, just a couple of months ago, he traveled to Chile together with a congressional delegation. And in his visit, he included a tour of the Memory and Human Rights Museum. And if any of you haven't been to Chile and you're planning to go, I encourage everyone to visit the museum. It's a museum that honors the victims of the Pinochet's dictatorship. And Representative Castro also had the opportunity to meet with Chilean President Gabriel and his other government officials. He has been a strong supporter of U.S.-Chile relations and the shared principles of democratic governance, human rights, and the rule of law. We recognize his efforts to place human rights and democracy as central elements of U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America and at the U.S.-Mexico border, something that we very much need these days. Gracias. Thank you, Representative.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you. I'm Joaquin Castro and very proud to represent my hometown of San Antonio. And I feel like a stranger in a strange land because we're in the United States Senate and I serve in the United States House of Representatives. But great to be here with Senator Harkin, who served our country as a statesman for so long. Thank you, Senator, for being here. Of course, Ambassador, it's wonderful to see you again. We've enjoyed visiting with you here in Washington and also in Chile as well. And thank you to Carolina, to Marie, to Zaida, and the team at WOLA for organizing today's event and this discussion of Chile 50 years later, after the coup. A word on WOLA first. As you all know, for 50 years, for nearly 50 years, next year's the anniversary and celebration, WOLA has been a powerful voice for democracy, human rights, and social justice in Latin America and in the Caribbean, earning deep and enduring respect from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. For me, the impact of this work is not only professional, but also personal. My grandmother left the country in the midst of revolution, just after a revolution, the Mexican Revolution. And during my years in Congress, I've had the opportunity to travel across our hemisphere for important conversations about the role of the United States in supporting freedom and respect, and most of all, the rule of law. Under the Biden administration, the United States has made a real effort to center humility, mutual respect, and multilateral cooperation with our neighbors. But as we all know, those values have not always defined the United States' approach to Latin America. There are plenty of examples, but the 1973 coup in Chile stands as one of the most tragic illustrations of American leaders putting ideology and politics over human rights. Last month, I visited Colombia and Chile with colleagues from the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Our trip was one of the first delegations to South America led by U.S. legislators who came of age with a clear understanding of the consequences of American Cold War policy and its effect on our neighbors in Latin America. The legacy of American involvement in the 1973 coup loomed large over the trip as we visited Chile's Museum of Memory and Human Rights and met with people who had seen their parents and grandparents disappear, never to be seen again. But as I was also grateful to see a willingness, especially among young people, to build a relationship with the United States that looks beyond the mistakes of the past. During the Cold War years, the United States assumed that right-wing leaders in Latin America were friends, and left-wing leaders were potential allies of the Soviet Union or outright foes of ours. In our frenzy to stamp out socialism, we betrayed our own values and supported authoritarian leaders like Pinochet, who were only too glad to leverage our paranoia to advance their own political power. As we look towards the future, especially in this era of rising competition with China, the United States needs to think seriously about how to avoid the deadly foreign policy errors we made during the Cold War. As they say, we shall not let history repeat itself. Fundamentally, our pathway to a stronger regional relationship and relationships has to begin with a foundation of truth, transparency, honesty, and accountability. I strongly support recent moves by the Biden administration to declassify materials related to the 1973 coup, and I'd like to see all the materials related to the coup fully declassified within the next few years following appropriate review. I serve on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and have for 7 years. And when I've raised the issue of declassification with committee leadership, folks have generally been receptive. If we want to have an open, honest relationship with Chile, we need to be honest about our role in leading their country into the dark years of Pinochet dictatorship. On another note of recent progress, I was glad to see the United States Senate approve the U.S.-Chile tax treaty over the summer. Congressman Jerry Connolly, Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar, and I introduced a bipartisan resolution earlier this year urging the Senate to take this important step, and the treaty advanced to President Biden's desk on an overwhelming vote of 95-2. Once the Chilean Senate re-ratifies the treaty, I'm hopeful it will serve as the basis for deeper economic engagement between our two nations. And last year, as you all know, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act with significant incentives for electric vehicle development that could benefit the Chilean lithium mining sector. It's a priority for me to work with our partners in civil society and government to ensure that the benefits of lithium mining are equitably shared with Chile's indigenous communities and to help mitigate the environmental harms that can result from mining. Chilean President Boric, who I had the pleasure to meet during my trip to Chile in August, will be coming to the United States toward the end of September, and I look forward to seeing many of these issues raised in high-level conversations. At a time of democratic backsliding in the Western Hemisphere and around the world, including troubling trends, as we all know, within our own country, Chile stands as an important example of how to rebuild a democratic and representative government without forgetting about the past. And Chile's history should serve as a constant reminder of our responsibility to be a better partner within our own hemisphere. I'm grateful for WOLA's commitment to progress in Chile and across Latin America, and I'm optimistic about the promise of the future. Please reach out to me anytime. Please know that my door is always open. Thank you so much for all of your work.
As I said earlier today, we want to reflect on how civil society and the US Congress work to defend human rights and support a restoration of democracy in Chile. The events in Chile were a defining moment for advocacy, for policy, and legislation on human rights. And that is why we are doing this event today in the US Congress, because members of Congress in the US and the international community galvanized and took leadership. We know that the road to returning democracy to Chile was a very long one, and I have to say, it was a very painful one. It took a very long time. But it's important to discuss and to explore what lessons can be learned for today, especially now that new forms of authoritarian leaders are rising and democracy in Latin America, or I should say the Americas, faces new threats. We're here because we know that the commitment to human rights is both necessary and powerful in these struggles for justice and democracy. We're very honored to have this panel with us today. I would like to welcome Professor Stephen Volk, who traveled all the way to California just for this event. He is a professor of history emeritus at Oberlin College and a well-known expert on Chile. Thank you, Professor, for joining us. Senator Tom Harkin, who needs no introduction, especially in the US Congress, but has been a long-time ally of WOLA and a long-time ally of human rights. We thank you. And Ambassador Juan Gabriel Valdéz, current Ambassador of Chile to the United States. And if you were not here when I spoke earlier, Ambassador Valdéz is with us today on Chile's Independence Day. So we feel very lucky to have the Ambassador on Chile talking to us at such an important day for the Chilean diaspora in the US and for Chileans in general. Ambassador, we want to start with you. And we want to discuss the coup, of course, but the coup impact on regional politics. I mean, we know that the coup gave way to one of the most brutal dictatorships that Latin America has ever seen. But we also know that many governments and organizations in Latin America and in the US responded to the situation in Chile. So, what do you feel were the main repercussions in the region? And what was the role of all the governments in what was happening in Chile and in the response to what happened? Latin America.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I want to say that I'm extremely thankful to WOLA and to people who are leading this organization that was close to us since the beginning and supported us since practically the first day. Therefore, this relationship between WOLA and Chile is a very old one. It has probably almost 50 years. It was always important in the following terms. We were, I remember very well when we were working with Letelier here in Orlando, and there was a new piece of news that came to us from Chile. And the first thing we thought is, we have to tell WOLA. The first place where we went was WOLA, because we knew that there was the possibility of distributing this information, of making it known. Now, let me turn to the, first of all, I want to say also thanks to the persons who are with me in this table, and I value them enormously. I think that the impact of the coup in Latin America, in a sense, reproduced the impact that the coup had globally, because the idea that you could reach socialism through democratic means, and that you could push the social agenda through democratic means without using the concept of the idea of revolution in the traditional sense, was something that not only produced an enormous level of interest in intellectual terms, but was called to impact countries that were extremely influential in Latin America, for instance, the Europeans. Then we have to think today, I think, in terms, if we want to think in academic terms or in more intellectual terms, of what happened in Chile, and I'm sure that Alex will agree with me, that Frei, the previous president of Allende, before Allende, was a reformist who launched an agrarian reform, launched also the Chileanization, we said, of copper, which introduced a series of transformations in the relationship with the countryside and in the evolution of poblaciones in the center of in Santiago in particular. Therefore, even if at the time these two sectors were deeply divided, the reformists and the revolutionaries, in fact Allende was simply the continuation of a process of reforms that began in the 60s. Radicalization and continuation at the same time. Then the process itself had been enormously influential in the region. Frei was an enormous success in Latin America, in Colombia at the time, which was under Jiménez, the democratic government. In Venezuela, there was Rafael Caldera, the first mandate. Even in Argentina, before the coup, there was President Ilia, who had an excellent relationship with Frei. Therefore, the impact of the reformism of Chile was enormous in the region. This is the first consideration. The second consideration is that when the coup happened, coups had already happened in Argentina, in Brazil, and in other places. I don't know if the Uruguayan was already there, but it was close. Bolivia. Then what happened was there were two movements which were in a way dark and sinister. The first one was the famous Operación Condor, which was the way in which the secret police of Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay and Bolivia came together in order to murder abroad people who were in the opposition to the military coup in Chile. You had then the murder of General Prats in Buenos Aires, then the attempt against Bernardo Leito in Rome, and then the assassination of Orlando Letelier here. But you also had the assassination of a former Bolivian president, and you had the assassination of members of Congress, the Uruguayan Senate. Therefore, this was a very, very sinister impact of the fact that these countries were all governed by military leaders and military organizations. Another one, which is probably the contrary side, is that the level of insecurity that people had individually as a result of the brutality of the regimes and the authoritarian nature of the governments was expanded also to the borders of the countries themselves. The military in Chile thought that the fact that they had been isolated by an international reaction against the coup, against the death of Allende, would produce an attack from Peru. And then the result was that we have had during 20 years the terrible task of trying to find the mines that were deep in the desert, in the border between Chile and Peru, because the military in Chile that were also attentive to the possibility of an Argentinian attack had to protect the desert through bombs, through personal bombs. We almost got into a situation of war with Argentina, because the Argentinians thought that the Chileans were sufficiently weak as to consider themselves as a possibility of considering them as a possibility of solving through military means disputes we had on islands and on territories of the extreme south of both countries. They, as you know, they opted to change the course and take the Malvinas and introduce the war with Great Britain. But the point is that the military were extremely insecure of what would happen. And solution to these problems with Argentina and with Peru only came when civilian governments came back. I think that the same, I don't want to get into this, I'm finishing the answer, but the point is that it was not only the impact of the coup, was also the impact of the transition, because the transition happened almost at the same time in different countries. I remember very well going to Buenos Aires to celebrate the election of Alfonsín. There were thousands and thousands of Chileans at the end of the military dictatorship in Chile who traveled to Buenos Aires simply to celebrate the coming back of democracy in Argentina. Then I think that there has always been a sort of contagion between the countries of the southern part of Latin America in terms of their policies. But I think that we are lucky that we didn't fall into the traps of a possible war between us at that time. And this is the only positive thing I could say about the times in which the 3 or 4 countries of the area were governed by military governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Senator, I think during your time in Congress, we all know you spent many years pushing for human rights legislation. And legislation that you passed continues to be incredibly important. You can be credited with the First Amendment prohibiting U.S. military aid to governments that abuse human rights. A long time has passed, and we're still pushing for that legislation. What do you think was the main impact of the legislation? How do you think it influenced U.S. foreign policy from that time to now? And if you can tell us about your own personal experience trying to pass this legislation at that time, especially around the coup in Chile, and all the difficult political events of the time.
Mr. Ambassador, it's nice to be with you again, and also Steve Volk and WOLA. And going back a little bit in history here, the Chilean coup in 1973 had terrible outcomes for the Chileans, and we reverberated down through the years. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But out of that catastrophe came something good. Joe Eldridge, whom we all know, was the founder of WOLA, was in Santiago during those days when the military assassinated Allende and took over the government, and people started disappearing, and opponents were executed. And so Joe came back and on the basis of that, began to organize a group of people here in Washington on Latin America. And so WOLA was founded a year after, 1974. Well, that's the year I got elected, so I wasn't here at that time. I got elected in 74, and I was here in 75. Because of some of my human rights work before I came to Congress, meaning dealing with the Vietnam War and that thing that we go into that. I had done some speaking around the country for the Methodist Church, which had the Board of Social Concern, that's what it was called then. I don't know what it's called now. And this had to do with mostly Vietnam War, involving human rights, and so Joe, being a Methodist minister at that time, knew about me, and some of my supporters in Iowa got a hold of him, and he got a hold of me. And so in 1975, WOLA, Joe Eldridge and others, and the Institute for Policy Studies, and the ambassador was, I believe, around that time, began to worked up proposals for human rights legislation. And it turned out that I don't know why they picked on me, but they got a hold of me to offer this amendment. I can go into more detail if we don't have time. This amendment to the foreign aid bill. Now, I became sort of tuned at that time in what had gone on in Chile. I'd never been to Chile before. I was busy sort of running the re-election 73, 74, and I knew what had happened, of course. And through my liberal contacts, knew how bad things had gotten in Chile under Pinochet, but I had not been involved. The foreign aid bill was on the House floor. And WOLA had basically drafted this amendment. Like the yes, I don't know who, maybe the ambassador drafted it. Whoever put it all together. And they wanted to get someone to offer. They got me to offer. I'm not on the foreign aid committee, and I'm a freshman. I've only been there, it's been September or so of 75. So I've only been there 9 months. And the foreign aid bill was on the floor. And in those days, you would offer amendments. So I offered this amendment on human rights on the House floor, thinking that it probably wasn't going to go anywhere. Although, I'll add something in a minute. So the amendment came up, and here's how it passed. We had some liberals who were not opposed to it, just because of certain structural things in the House. You know, I'm not on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and there's other things you got to think about and all that kind of stuff. And it turned out that a lot of them Republican conservatives were for it. Now, why were they for it? Because they felt that if this was added to the foreign aid bill, the foreign aid bill would go down and they were opposed to foreign aid. So I had this crazy thing of some conservative Democrats and a few, and the conservative Republicans voted for it and passed it. Well, now it's on the foreign aid bill. Now the Senate doesn't have that on the foreign aid bill. But when it went to conference, in those days we actually had conferences where the Senate and House would meet. And by this time, I'm up to my eyeballs in this amendment, trying to save it. And I actually went to see Senator Humphrey, who had campaigned for me in Iowa, and asked for his support for this amendment. Well, when I came over, they were meeting in a room like this over here at the Senate Conference Committee, and Humphrey wasn't there. And so I asked for who his staff person was. And someone pointed out this guy had long hair, that kind of thing, looked a little disheveled. So I went over and spoke to him. I said, "We're Senator Humphrey. I'd been in contact with him about this amendment. I just wanted to make sure he's going to be okay in supporting this." And the guy said, "He's not going to be here today." I said, "Well, can he get his proxy?" Because he was sent proxies. Well, it turned out that he had gotten a hold of Senator Humphrey, who was gone someplace, and he got his proxy and voted for it and kept the amendment in the final legislation. That young man was Bill Richardson, who just recently, unfortunately, passed away. But we established a relationship based on that and continued it on through most of his life. But that became Section 116D of the Foreign Assistance Act, and it's still in the law today. And it basically prohibited the foreign aid to countries, I got the language No assistance may be provided under this part of the government of any country which engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights, including torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, prolonged detention without charges, or other flagrant denials of the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person. And here's a loophole: unless such assistance will directly benefit the needy people of such country. Still part of the law today. Now, I mentioned that I brought this up. We had a tentative agreement with some people in the House that we needed to do something like this on the foreign aid bill first. Next year, and that was in March of '76 when I went to Chile with Joe and Rebecca and Toby Moffat and George Miller and uncovered the existence of people in Chile who I don't know what else, and we went to Vietnam only. But that September we had the security bill, not the foreign aid, but the military assistance bill. And so Don Frazier from Minnesota offered the amendment to that, which became Section 502 of the military system, which is basically the same language as what I had, basically. And we had agreed to basically do it on foreign aid first. And once we had so many congressmen supporting cutting foreign aid, could they then say, well, we can cut foreign aid, but we can't cut military assistance? So we used this as the way of getting 502 enacted. So I can actually say that by the end of '76, most, I think all security aid to Chile had been stopped. And most foreign aid had been stopped. Some little trickles from AID, and that's about it. But one other point I wanted to make, and I made this earlier at an event that I was at, they mentioned about a week ago with WOLA. And that is that, and I always want to drive this point home, and I looked it up since that time I was with you last week. Under President Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, a lot of aid was given to Latin America. The #1 recipient of aid was Chile. From 1964 to '69, they received over $1 billion in aid from the United States. And as soon as Allende got elected, and we had Richard Helms' diary to tell us what Nixon said about we're going to make their economy scream, because they saw Allende as a Marxist, as a communist, and we can't have that in our hemisphere. So they make the economy scream. From that, after Allende, the first year after Allende, the U.S. aid went plummeted to $10 million. And then it continued. Then there wasn't any aid the second and third year. Also at the same time, we had been supporting in the banks, World Bank and the Inter-American World Bank was loaning under good terms to Chile. Once Allende came in, if you look at the amount of loans from the banks to Chile, it just plummeted. I don't have the exact figures, but just plummeted. And so that economy, we interfered in their economy, and basically, I still believe that one of the major reasons that led to the Pinochet and the military taking over was because of, and this is why I hope Joaquin Castro is right. We've got to get these records released. We've got to get the files released. However, I'll tell you, they're not going to do it as long as Henry Kissinger's alive. And I've said this before publicly, and I say it again. Under any system of rationality or common sense or democratic ideals, Henry Kissinger would have been tried as a war. Long. But he's still alive. I think he's 101 or something. I don't know what I don't know how he is now. But I think these files and these records will show his heavy hand. And he opposed every one of our amendments. Everything we tried to do up here, because he was before up until Carter got in. So when we offered these amendments in 75 and 76, he was marshaling all of his forces to try to defeat these amendments. Well, that's enough for me.
Thank you, Senator. I think we all agree that perpetrators of human rights violations should, perpetrators of human rights violations should be tried and should face justice. We cannot agree more.
No other country was able to galvanize the national solidarity and the advocacy that Chile did, not just in the US, but also globally. What would you say about that? I mean, what made the Chilean experience so different from the others?
Well, thank you, and thanks to WOLA and co-panelists here. The question that's posed is why was solidarity with Chile so unusually strong in the United States? And I have trouble answering it only in the sense that I tend to look at everything through a kind of Chilean lens, and granted, perhaps more importance than it's due, but I don't think so. Part of that is my own life goes back to Chile in many ways. I went to Chile for the first time as a high school student in 1963, studying at the Liceo Eduardo Barra, which I found out later was the same school that Salvador Allende went to when he was living in Valparaiso. And I had an ancient chemistry professor who I imagine he probably had as well when he was studying there, because he talked much more about communism than about H2O or anything else like that. I returned to Chile in 1972 and lived there from 72 through the coup, and left about 6-7 weeks after the coup. And so the issue of Chile solidarity in the United States in particular is something that I've been deeply involved in, and something that's always intriguing as a question of why. Guatemala, a coup in 1954, perhaps some over these years, 200,000 people, mostly indigenous Mayas, have been killed. Argentina, with its coup in 1976, probably 30,000 people disappeared. I don't want to have a sort of Olympics of repression, but Chile is not at the top of it. And so why does it attract so much attention in this country in particular? And I think there's a number of reasons that I could point to. One is what I would call before and after. The change between a difficult but democratic process, a country which prided itself on the peaceful transition from one president to another over many, many decades, was shattered overnight, and in its place was imposed a brutal dictatorship. I stood on the balcony of my apartment, which was a few blocks from the Moneda, and watched the Hawker Hunter jets circling the building, threatening to carry out the attack which they said they would deliver if Allende did not surrender and resign. And they swooped by the first time, and then they left. They can't do it. This is a democratic country. This will never happen. And they came back the second time, and I could see the smoke coming out of the Moneda. And it's that stark difference, day and night. By the time we were allowed out of our houses in a few days after that, when they lifted the curfew, it was a different country. And so the shocking difference between before and after is not the same as in Argentina, which had a much more sort of tumultuous, semi-democratic, non-democratic, not the same as in many other countries. And so that was one of the issues. The second issue I would call the difference between empathy and sympathy. There was a way in which, and this maybe I'm being cynical, but there was a way in which people in the United States could relate more to Chileans than they could to Haitians, than they could to Guatemalans. There's a large indigenous population in Chile, but the people appeared white. The editor of the newspaper, his name is Edwards. When I was in Valparaiso, I lived with the director of the Valparaiso branch of El Mercurio, whose name is Ledante. Famous intellectual, Suber Hasso. You have the Ross, you have the Edwards. And so there's a way in which Chile appeared more, I'm going to call it European, than other Latin American countries, which meant that the United States paid more attention to it than they would to Guatemala or Honduras. Right? The third thing is the fact that even before the coup, with Jack Anderson's columns on the ITT involvement in Chile, you begin to get a sense of the U.S. being deeply involved in the interior workings of a country. Right? Seymour Hersh will come out with his first serious revelations in 1974, and of course all the work that comes out of Congress at that time. But revelations that Guatemala, which will come 20 or 30 years later, began at that moment because of work that many people were doing before and directly after, and that brings it to a U.S. consciousness. There was the fact that two North Americans, Charlie Horman and Frank Girucci, were murdered by the Chilean military. You could talk about 25,000 people disappeared, but when you put the names and faces of two North Americans, people in this country pay more attention. It means something to them, and so it sort of rises to that level. I also think that there's a certain role that the press and photographers in particular play in this. The US media, which was very much opposed to Allende, very quickly changed its position. And part of the reason of that are the amazing photographs which began to come out of Chile within a week of the coup. Photographers, the Dutchman, Chas Gerrans and David Burnett, the Moneda's official photographer who took the picture of Allende in front of the Moneda with his rifle and a helmet on. These all began to have an impact. Right? And the most famous one of those, of course, is Gerrenson's photograph of Pinochet as the symbol of a dictator. He wanted the people to be frightened of him. It played in the United States in a very different way. This is, I'm reminded of a quote from a writer at The Atlantic talking about Trump's mugshot, in which he said, he treats his mugshot as our menace. Well, that's what Pinochet did in that. And it plays into a sense that wasn't that many decades before of Nazi Germany. When you see books burning on the streets, when you see the Moneda in flames and you think of the Reichstag, right? When just the fact that the Chilean military was equipped by the Germans and they wore the high boots and they wore the hair helmet. These things have a resonance that North Americans will respond to in a way that they simply won't to other countries. And then, of course, there's the work that many people did around this. WOLA, of course. I worked, when I came back with NACLA, North American Congress on Latin America, for 13 years. We were very instrumental in doing that. And a lot of the work was done by those of us who were in Chile and came back. And after a few years, when the U.S. finally let Chilean refugees into the country, 400 of them, they began this work as well. Very large, very effective solidarity organizations. The National Chile's Committee on Solidarity, the NICH, Non-Intervention in Chile. The ecumenical approach, the church groups, which had a tremendous impact on this. Chile, in many ways, created a human rights movement. That's what many people say. And the fact that it was located within the human rights framework allowed many more people to understand that and to express their solidarity with that. And finally, and there's many other points, but timing is really everything. 1973, the U.S. is pulling out of Vietnam. It's in the middle of Watergate. There is a sense in which a door slightly opens to allow people like Jack Anderson and Seymour Hersh to publish in a way that they wouldn't be able to 10 years before that time. And so you begin to get stories out because of the unusual, remarkable circumstances surrounding all these events. And Congress can take advantage of that, and the media takes advantage of that. And so you can read things as they're happening rather than waiting for the foreign relations publications that will come out 25 years later. All of these make a solidarity movement, which then will be transferred both in personnel and in operations to Central America at the end of the 1970s.
Thank you, Professor. And Professor Volk has researched and written extensively on these issues. So we were talking to Representative Castro earlier, and it got us thinking that now there are a lot of threats to democracy in this 21st century that perhaps we never anticipated. Now, you work with many other members of Congress to push for human rights legislation, to push for democracy in Latin America. If you had to give advice to current policymakers in the U.S. to support democracy, what would those advices be? An easy question.
You have to rely and cast your lot with those that have a history of supporting democracy and human rights, and be sort of questioning those sources of information that basically come from the private sector. I'm thinking more about the extractive industries, the minings, the oils, things like that. And they have a lot of influence here. So if you really want to support democratic movements in Latin America, be more open and receptive and get your staff to be involved with some of the groups in those countries that have a long history of involvement in supporting human rights and supporting democratic reforms. And constantly look for new ways of developing legislation here, or need bills, whatever it might be, to again, buttress those groups, help those groups. There's ways of doing it. You can do it. And if I might take one more minute, I did this research that I mentioned it about a week ago, and I forgot about it. Now I remember it. I found out. So Chile led to me and Joe going to Guatemala and going to El Salvador and Nicaragua and all these other things. But Chile never left us. We just got so frustrated that we couldn't quite get rid of Pinochet. Finally, thanks to the Chileans, as you know, the plebiscite movement started. And so Pinochet, thinking that he was invulnerable, that there's no way this motley crew out there could ever organize or something, agreed to the plebiscite. And here's what I'm saying. What's my advice to others? Take a cue from what I did at that time. I was on the Appropriations Committee. I haven't really been much involved with Chile since via Grimaldi and the human rights amendments. I've been involved in other aspects of that. But what I did was when the plebiscite was announced, I got $2 million. I thought it was only one. I thought it was $2 million. I got $1 million in my appropriations bill as an earmark. Earmarks are back again. I got it as an earmark. $1 million to the National Democratic Institute and the National Endowment for Democracy for the promotion of democratic activities in Chile regarding the plebiscite. And then I got another $1 million to pay for an international observer delegation to monitor the 1988 Chilean plebiscite. In fact, my staff person at that time was Ed Long, and he was in Punta Arenas observing, and we sent all these observers all over. Now, I have to tell you, I had my people dig into this. The $1 million that we put into the National Endowment for Democracy and the National Democratic Institute, 400,000 of that went to nonpartisan groups and projects. One of the projects was identification photographs for voter registration. Another prepared a citizen manual for citizens to understand how to vote in the plebiscite. Didn't take an issue which way or the other, just said, here's how you vote. And the third was to monitor the election and provide independent returns. So they formed people to go out to the polls and report the returns as soon as the polls closed, as soon as they had the results. 366,000 was used for publicity and advertising by the National Command for the No, which included 9 Chilean opposition parties. $150,000 to 2 trade union groups, the National Workers Command and the Democratic Workers Command. $50,000 to then Euro whose owners were Christian Democrats, and $50,000 for a political research institute to undertake a poll. Then I went to Peter Hart, who had done my polling, got a pollster. And so Peter Hart offered his services free to do polling in Chile. So we had some of the results of that poll, and someone else. Anyway, so this money went to all these groups to organize for the No campaign. And then we had the International Observer Group. So, long answer to a very quick, what's my advice? Do these kinds of things. Fund these kinds of groups. Use your appropriations committee. A couple of $1 million goes a long way. It doesn't have to be billions or hundreds of millions. A few $100,000 for things like this can really go a long way when it goes to groups like this.
Thank you, Senator. We're preparing our strategic advocacy plan. This was also good for us, and where we are going to put a lot of energy in our advocacy next year. Thank you. We appreciate that. I'm going to close with the same question for the two of you, because I think it's going to be very interesting to hear from academia and from the world of diplomacy what you believe can be drawn as lessons from the Chilean experience to the struggle for democracy today. And Professor Volk, if we could start with you and close with that.
Sure. It's a simple question and a really hard one, and one that I think many of us have been thinking about for, let's say, 50 years. What went wrong? How do we correct it? And these are processes that, you know, much better than I, are currently on this table in Chile as it discusses and moves through the constitutional process in a difficult manner. I guess I would say a few things. One, sort of going back to the previous point, solidarity is incredibly important. It couldn't overthrow Pinochet. It couldn't rewrite the Constitution that he left behind. but it prevented him from achieving the legitimacy that he so desired and that people like Nixon and Kissinger wanted to bestow on him. Pinochet was met, and his representatives were met with protests from the earliest days when they sent Willoughby around on a PR tour to try to talk up the great democratic movement and the great movement to restore democracy in Chile that Pinochet had. When Chilean players tried to participate in the Davis Cup, they were prevented. When a Chilean representative was in the Miss Universe contest, she was prevented. This is years after. This goes on and on and on. Coyote, which was an organization of sex workers in San Francisco, refused to service the naval people on board the torture ship Esmeralda when it docked as part of this tall ships process. These have an impact, and I would say probably the greatest impact when I think of it, not overturning Pinochet, but allowing a process in the world international legal context that ultimately would bring Pinochet, charges against Pinochet, and establish the principle of universal authority for human rights abuses, for crimes against humanity. This would not have happened without solidarity. It simply would not have happened. And so there's important things there. Other lessons, very quickly. I would take one lesson from the right and one lesson from the left. Living through Chile in its very difficult times in 1972 and 1973, I was struck by how centrist politicians became more and more convinced that a coup was the only way out, particularly after the March 1973 elections. The lesson there for honest conservative politicians is that once you give that process over to dictators, to authoritarians, to the military, you cannot control it. It is out of your hands. And if you think that going along with those forces that challenge institutionality, that challenge democracy, will more easily be brought back into your control, you're wrong. And Chile proves that. In terms of the left, and this is hard because we've thought about this for many years, and I consider myself a part of that. There is a real danger when you get out ahead of the masses, when you get out too far in front of a project, try to accomplish too much. I think I'm talking both about the constitutional process and about what happened in '73. You find yourself without a base. You can't recover that. There is a way, and now we'll bring it back to the constitutional process, one of the most exciting things before the drafting began was the dozens and dozens and dozens of cabildos abiertos, of open town meetings that began to discuss where should Chile go. That process of grassroots intervention became broken when people got ahead of the process. And so my advice on the left is you have to be tied in with that base, otherwise you will suffer from it. So those are the kinds of conclusions I would draw.
Thank you. I will follow very closely to what the professor is saying. I think that for me, personally, the most important lesson is that you cannot promote transformations, social transformations, you don't have a majority. It's as simple as that. I mean, if you go ahead with a group of people who cannot build coalitions that incorporate those who are not political. I'm talking much more than of a political center, of those who are not involved in politics because they think that they do not need to be involved in politics. If these people turns against you, it's very difficult to promote change. I was, at the time, in 1972, in the Congress of my own party at the time, called MAM. And we were at the stadium, at one stadium, Santa Laura Stadium that belonged to the Unión Española football club. And then you have there probably 15,000 people in the stadium. And at the same time that there was a show with songs and with singers and etc., dancers in the field, there was a big political discussion and an election inside the stadium of the new Secretary General of the party. It was February of the year 1973, February of 1973. And then the new leader comes out, and he is applauded by the stadium. And the only thing I remember was that he said at a certain point, some people, some compañeros have forgotten that in order to get to socialism, you have to go through the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I said to myself, these people are crazy. I mean, excuse me, but I was living in Santiago and I couldn't see where and from where could the dictatorship of anything come except from the military. It was obvious that there was a very difficult situation, and then the type of language that was used by some leaders at the time prevented them from having a majority of people in favor of the changes that Allende was promoting every day and the main forces inside the Popular Unity were promoting. I know that this is a debate that continues until now, but from my point of view, it is clear that, as you said, if you go very much ahead of the masses, you will not have any possibility of transforming anything. This is one thing. I knew very well the politicians were at the middle because my family belonged, I didn't belong at that time, but my family was very prominent in the Christian Democratic Party. My father was a very important leader of the Christian Democratic Party, even if he was at the left and he didn't support the coup in any moment. But the point is that this division inside the Christian Democratic Party, which led the majority to go I wouldn't say in favor, but waiting for the coup, because the coup was something like an asteroid that had to come into the earth without any solution, without any possible solution. That was the attitude of the government. The minority that was in favor of a plebiscite or a solution, a political solution to the crisis, was isolated, completely isolated. And of course, the whole machine of the conservative sectors that were pushing for a coup, beginning by the newspapers and an important part of the television forces or organizations at the time, had already decided. Therefore, when you heard these center-left politicians that they were against the coup, but they didn't join Allende because they said that Allende was isolated as its own. There is a problem of dialogue there, which is extremely important. And this is a moment in which, after 50 years, a lot of books have been published on Chile. And some of the actors of the time have published their memoirs. And when you read the memoirs, and you cannot but think that people tend to arrange their stories with time. Because I've heard versions of things that I knew at the time, and I was not directly compromised because I was very young. I was just a student. But I heard a lot of things at my father's house at the time, and I saw a lot of people I trusted, like Cardinal Silva Enriquez, who was the leader of the Catholic Church, and somewhere, in a sense, the leader of the human rights opposition against the military dictators. I took note of his conversations with my father at the time. And I don't want to give you a sort of synopsis of my future memoirs. But what I can say is that when I read the books that are being published now, they are so distant of what I learned at the time of what was going on. For instance, the last meeting between the President Allende and President Kaine was completely different from what I read according to what I heard at the time from the Cardinal, who was inviting the two leaders to discuss 2 weeks before the coup. What I heard of that meeting from the Cardinal and from the people who were with him is, to say the least, a bit distant of what President Kaine has in his memoirs. This is not probably a debate that should be supported now, but when you want to see, when you want to think on the consequences of all this, and you want to think on how to prevent this from happening once again, I think that you have to remember the facts as they were. This is why I'm telling you the story of what happened in that stadium and the type of speech that were said at the time by some leaders of the left, and at the same time, a certain tendency among the center-right leaders to fool themselves and think that the coup would last 2 days, 3 days, and then there would be an election, and then a new Christian Democratic leader would be elected, which is practically the logic that led the Christian Democrats, or the majority of the Christian Democrats, to the coup. It's difficult because, as you know, during the last 3 weeks, Chile has been reflecting on what happened. And the reflection has been extremely difficult because, contrary to what we thought, instead of turning a majority of the country in favor of human rights and in favor of a memory that would prevent us from going back to these times, there are a series of people in Chile who believe that it is uncomfortable and, in a sense, ugly to talk about these things. And therefore, these things should not be recalled and memory shouldn't exist too much because we have to look to the future. And then those who are thinking about these tragedies are dividing the country. This type of speech has prevented us from having a national unity around what we say, nunca más, never again. This is something that is pain today. It's something that makes us uncomfortable and makes us erodes our optimism on the future of our political system. I have to say that this morning when I received the friends who were coming to the house to celebrate our National Day, I said that the 18th of September is the moment in which, after dark, the sun comes back and people feel that they belong to the same nation and they have to discuss among themselves and they have to dance, to sing and to drink. But the point is that I underline that because it is clear that we need a lot of optimism and a lot of positive thinking in order to reflect on what happened 50 years ago, and we need that. And I think that what the solidarity movement has done in this country in the past is also very important today. People in this country who remember what happened, who reflect on what happened, is absolutely essential for Chileans to continue this very difficult path towards a reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sorry we have run out of time, but I think you will all agree that it was incredibly interesting and important to listen to all your analysis and your reflections. I would like to thank once again Senator Kaine's office for supporting us in doing this event, and also the Embassy of Chile. And I would also like to say gracias to the WOLA team, because they have been working very hard for us to be here today, comms team and also our executive assistant, So gracias, equipo, for supporting us. Stay with us, there is some refreshment in the back, and we have a lot of things to discuss after this incredibly deep conversations.
And Professor Volk, Señor Embajador,
Muchas gracias.
and Senator Harkin, thank you very much for being here.